But I think it's time to go on to Reb Zalman. What do you think, Rabbi?
Yes, let's do. So today we're going to just look, we're going to finish a little bit of the Reb Zalman. And I love that Harold pointed out that yesterday was his yort site. He is a very significant, a little bit controversial because of some accusations that were made about him. I had him as a teacher, and he was a profound teacher in my life. I personally don't like guru types in general, so I don't want to be a guru. I don't want a guru, and he was a bit of a guru, so that I stayed a little bit away from him. But because he had what nobody else who's functioning in the Jubu world has, this deep Jewish depth and deep Eastern depth, I think he has some extraordinary things to offer. I saw somebody put in the chat Sylvia Boorstein. Sylvia doesn't have. I love Sylvia Boorstein. I've read all of her books. I think she is a fantastic teacher of Buddhism that respects Judaism. She herself does not have a deep Jewish background. So she absolutely respects Judaism, and she doesn't reject it in the way that, let's say, Sharon Salzberg does in a certain way, because it's really not in Sharon's universe. Sylvia is still in the universe of Judaism, but she knows very, very, very little. Zalman grew up in a Hasidic household with a Hasidic uh, uh, background, trained to be a rabbi. So his depth is really unique in this intersection of Eastern and Jewish life. That's why I think he is so valuable. Anything he writes is valuable. Later on in his life, soon before, in the years before he died, he probably got deeper and deeper into Eastern and less, but he was always deeply rooted in Jewish. He understood and was fluent in Jewish texts, in Jewish theology, in a way that nobody else is in the Eastern world. So for those of you who are interested in Eastern religions, I strongly recommend reading his work. And yes, I would recommend buying this book. We'll be using it more going forward, and it's a beautiful and unique. The most recent edition, as we found out yesterday, from 2014, has the additional introduction, which I referred to yesterday. And thank you for letting us know there are multiple. It's in paperback, as you can see. It's not expensive. Wonderful book. Okay,
And
so I want to just.
here's this book about davening that I
His
got
book
when I
about
went to see
davening.
it. Very good.
Yeah. So anything he writes, especially for those who are interested in this Eastern and Western intersection, Eastern and Jewish intersection, Zalman is really the master, and he has many, many, many students. Somebody, I think Chazan Hirsch mentioned Marsha Prager. There's a next generation after him.
Rabbi David Ingbert, Romamu, is one of his.
Yep, exactly. And anyway, so I'm not going to go into the whole thing about his life and all the various controversies and who he was, but for studying Jewish text with a deep understanding of Yiddishkeit and an equally deep understanding of Eastern, nobody comes close. Nobody. None of his students and nobody before him. He was really unique in the depth of this intersection. So I just want to read through this and point out a few things quickly, and then we're going to move on today. But notice, if you could move it up a little bit, Harold, I'll keep my own copy open as well, so I have it here. That first of all, he is not at all uncomfortable with leaving behind the he or they, and goes right into seeing this as a very personal prayer. And I like very much what he says, but because you are with me, I won't panic if I have to face evil. I find that to be a very interesting read of that fourth verse, which talks about how do we respond to Begate Salmavet. That what's his response? He doesn't say we're not going to face evil. I like that he does this. I won't say that evil won't emerge, and in this case, he's somebody who certainly lived through and was aware of the Holocaust and evil in the world. And one thing that I like about Zalman is that he's not uncomfortable with acknowledging that there is evil in the world and understanding that it exists. Sometimes it's internal evil, sometimes it's external evil. So because you are with me, I won't panic if I have to face evil, I think is a very interesting read of this. Both your rebuke and your bracing support give me comfort. So in this case, Zalman is looking at the rod and staff as being opposite. That one is a form of rebuke and one is a form of love and support. Also, I think a very interesting read of that verse, that he's understanding sometimes we have to be rebuked and sometimes we need comfort. Both of those are true. And the presence of adversity, using the word adversity, which we've seen before, you set me a feast at which my anxious head is soothed. What a beautiful image of the oil, and my thirst is amply slaked. Because you have invited me, I affirm that only goodness and graciousness will manifest for the rest of my life, in which I will always be at home with you. All right, I just wanted to point out those few things about Zalman. I find him a very creative reader and challenging, and because of his deep, deep comfort with the Jewish tradition, he's able to do things that I find modern people less comfortable with alone, like evil. Like, I find that we're a little squeamish about acknowledging evil in the world, and a little squeamish about that. And he embraces it, and he says, "What evil exists? What do I get from my relationship with God? This is a great example. I get that I won't panic. That I have a North Star. I know what to do. I have a sense of where my compass is, even when I encounter evil." Okay, so I just wanted to do that to finish up Zalman. We're not going to spend more time on him. I do encourage people to buy the book, and we'll continue adding his take on the Psalms to our study. And now I'm going to turn it over to Harold, who is going to lead us through a study of the King James.
All right, I practiced with Rabbi Moskowitz. I'm almost at Rabbi Moskowitz speed for this presentation because there's so much to talk about. I'm going to talk about the King James Bible, but first I'd like to put it into a little bit of perspective. So before printing, there was the Hebrew Bible, which was written in Hebrew, which was translated into Aramaic, probably not written, but just on the fly. There seems to be evidence in Ezra for about 500 BCE. And then, as we've discussed, it was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, approximately 300 BCE. And these would, of course, have been manuscript translations. I will give a little credit here to Leonard Greenspoon. Many of us went to his fascinating presentation last week at JTS about Jewish Bible translations. The Christian New Testament was written in Greek about 100 CE forward. And then both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament were translated into Latin piecemeal, not the whole thing, called Vetus Latina, which is the Latin, but Old Latin. The entire Bible was translated by St. Jerome, who I guess would be called the Robert Alter of his day, since it is one person who translated the whole thing from one end to another, at approximately 400. Jerome did use the original language text whenever possible, the Greek and the Latin. So that is 400 CE is pretty much the end of the classical era. And then we move into what may be called the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. Vernacular translations, vernacular being the language spoken by the common people of parts of the Bible, were done from 800 CE on. Often translated, but the Hebrew Bible portions were often translated from the Latin Vulgate. The people doing the translations knew Latin and did not know the Hebrew. 4 Gospels were translated into Old English, approximately 990 CE. And then the first full English translation was done prior to the printing press by John Wycliffe in 1383, based on the Vulgate. It was more of an interlinear, a really literal translation. And I will not go into all of the translators who were killed because they did translations. Prior to the Reformation, the scriptures and the use thereof were very carefully controlled by the clergy. The Reformation, starting with the theses the theses on the door meant that the common people were then encouraged to read and study the Bible. So Wycliffe, all of this up to this point has been manuscripts, and if you wanted a Bible, you had to have someone copy out for it. It was expensive, and certainly everybody did not have one at home. The very first book printed in its entirety was the Gutenberg Bible in 1435, which was, of course, in Latin. The next real milestone here is Martin Luther's German Bible. I have been led to understand that the German in which this was an important book, not just for religion, but also for German. It was, as Dante was the first magnificent accomplishment in Italian, and that Dante wrote in Italian established the standard Italian. The German that Martin Luther used to translate the Bible is like our Shakespeare or King James. That the fact that the Bible was translated into this magnificent German was formative in German. Then we go to the other English translations. There was a translation by Tyndale, which he did not complete, but which was completed by Coverdale. This was the first printed English Bible in 1526. Then, based on Coverdale, there was something called the Great Bible in 1538, and then the Geneva Bible in 1560, which was the first to divide text into verses, and then the Bishop's Bible of 1568. There are fascinating Wikipedia articles about all of these. Then we come to the King James Version, which I will be talking to in a moment in more detail. And then we get to some interesting things. In 1917, we have the old JPS, which is based on the King James Version, which is the first really broad English translation done in the United States. 1985 was the new JPS, which was an original translation. In 1989 was the new Revised Standard Version, which is now the standard Christian translation. Although many Christians love the King James Bible, Protestant Christians, it is not the one used currently in most churches. So the creation of the King James Bible, it started in 1604 when there was a conference in Hampton Court Palace, if you've ever been there. There were 6 panels of translators, 47 men in all. They were given individual parts to translate, and then when they completed their translations, they passed them around, and then they finally gave them to their Marcia Melnick to make sure that they all matched. What they wanted to do was to limit Puritan influence, which had influenced some earlier translations. They did not want any marginal notes on the content, only on grammatical issues, because the Puritans who had done marginal notes had said things like, "Thus always two tyrants," and had used biblical characters and biblical stories to fight against what they thought were the errors of the church and the errors of the government. The translation reflected the episcopal nature of the Anglican Church. So when you had in Greek ecclesia, which could be translated many ways, they translated it as church, not congregation. The Hebrew Bible translation part was based on Daniel Bomberg's Hebrew Rabbinic Bible from Venice. None of the people doing the translation were Jewish, although Hebrew knowledge was much prized at this point. They were all Anglican clergy people. And the King James Version that we use right now is really the 1796 Oxford edition, which was corrected and standardized. The language in the King James Bible, and I take this from Wikipedia, it was archaic even for its time. In a period of rapid linguistic change, the translators avoided contemporary idioms, tending instead towards forms that were already slightly archaic, like verily and it came to pass. The pronouns thou, thee, and ye, you are consistently used as singular and plural, respectively. Even though by this time it was often found as you was often found as the singular in general English usage instead of thee and thou, especially when addressing a social superior. For the possessive of the third person pronoun, the word its, they avoided it to use his. Another sign of linguistic conservatism is the invariable use of eth for the third person singular present form of the verb, as an angel of the Lord appeareth to Joseph in a dream. The rival lending s appears, as found in present day English, was already widely used by this time. For example, it predominates over eth in the plays of Shakespeare and Marlowe. So the language that the translators used was intentionally somewhat archaic. So on that is basically a very brief history of how the King James Bible came to be. We will now look at the King James Bible. Let me see where I have it here. Hold on, let me open that. Let's see. Okay. And I will show you some of the salient points. This is a scan, not my scan. This is a scan of the King James Bible. And you'll see on top, there is a running head. Marcia Melnick taught us about running heads. We use them in our prayer book. Psalm 23. Each psalm has a little is a little explanation from the editors. This one is David's confidence in God's grace. So as you'll notice, it's done in what's called the black letter or the Germanic script for the first printing, which was felt to be more formal and more suited to something of this nature, with these beautiful initials. So here is a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd. Now, do you see this little is? The little is not in black letters is because that is their translation of Adonai Roi. The translators added is, they showed that is not in the original Hebrew. It is added for sense by making it small and in regular type. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. You see this little crux here? It's a little hard to read on the left here, but it says they knew what the Hebrew, they say Hebrew pastures of tender grass. So the translators said, we know that this says pastures of tender grass literally in the Hebrew, but we're translating it into green pastures because we feel that is easy, that is easier to, we like it more. And then here's another crux for the still waters, and it says Hebrew waters of quietness. So they knew Mei Menuchot was waters of quietness, but they translated it as still waters. There are also here notes where they feel that this text refers back or has language similar, or you might want to compare it to something else. Here we have another cross, anointeth my head with oil, and it says Hebrew, maketh fat with oil. And then forever, house of the Lord forever, Hebrew, to length of days. So this is what it looks like in that 1611 publication. Beautifully done. Let's see, there's another, okay. Thou art with me, ata imadi, that you and with me, they add art here. And you'll notice throughout the Bible, there are other places, the earth is the Lord, etc., etc. So that is what the King James Bible looks like in the original version. And I'm now going to give you some of what I found to be interesting comparisons. So this happened even to Jerome, that when you have a text that you recite over and over and over again in translation, you tend to get used to that translation and love that translation and want to use that translation. So there are actually two complete translations of Psalms in the Latin Vulgate Bible. There was the older one that Jerome found, and he put it in the first time around because that was the translation that people were using, and they were used to saying the Latin version of the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. When he then went back to the original Hebrew, he made a second translation, which he felt was more accurate and was more reflective of what the Hebrew actually said. And so there are both of them, the one that people were used to using, and then the one that he felt was more accurate. This shows up very interestingly here, because I've referred over and over again to the Psalter, which is used in the Anglican Church. Although we think of the King James Bible as being the most Anglican, the most British of translations, actually the Psalter that is used in the Anglican Church up to contemporary times use that old Coverdale version. So this is the older 1538 translation in the prayer book, and the King James Version updated this for biblical readings in the Book of Common Prayer. They do use the King James Version, but in the Psalms, they still use the old one. The Lord is my shepherd, therefore can I lack nothing, versus the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but I will email it to everybody so you can see this interesting how an older translation was superseded by a newer translation. And then I have a little comparison here between, I think this will be a surprise. Who here grew up with the JPS 1917 version? I know I'm familiar with it because this is the one that I got for my bar mitzvah. It says, and it has a little book plate from 1970. Naomi Hirsch is raising her hand that she grew up with it. So here is the King James Version. Here is the JPS translation from 1917. I can only see, it is almost exactly just the King James Version for this psalm. I can only find two places where the text has been changed. Instead of he leadeth me in the paths of righteousness, he guideth me in the paths of righteousness. And then instead of thou anointest my head with oil, thou has anointed my head with oil. I was actually shocked that the JPS 1917, at least for Psalm 23, is almost exactly. I know in other places it is probably varies a little bit more. Then this is why the JPS, Jewish Publication Society, retranslated the Hebrew Bible released that in 1985. This is JPS, which is also the Sepharia text and the text that is generally used. I believe it's the text used in our Plowed commentary. And you can see how very different this is. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He leads me to waters in places of repose. I will say that the Psalm 23, since the King James Version is so known and loved, is probably the hardest one for a translator to change. Alter makes a note on this, but this shows how even with the Jewish translations, there is a change from how it's based on, first it's based on the King James Version, and then it becomes something new. So that is my quick run through it. And if the rabbi will give me one more minute, Rabbi, can I have one more minute for someone?
Of course, as much
have
as
to
you
share?
want.
Okay.
Fabulous.
So this is something very special. This is the Bay Psalter. The Bay Psalter was the first book printed in America. The first book printed in America was a Psalter, which is the name of a prayer book, because this for worship is what you would be singing from. This was printed in 1640 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was, again, a group of ministers, all, of course, men, who spent several years putting it together. There are only I think there are 40 copies remaining of which only 7 are full. And the last one that sold for $14 million. These were, of course, something like this that gets printed. It's very, very well used, like the first spellers. So here it is. To save space, everything is printed. It just runs on one to another. This is Psalm 23, a Psalm of David, and you have to listen to it to see what they're doing. The Lord to me a shepherd is, want therefore shall not I. He in the folds of tender grass doth cause me down to lie. To waters calm me gently leads, restores my soul doth he. He doth in paths of righteousness, for his name's sake lead me. Yea, though in the valley of death's shade I walk, none ill I'll fear, Because thou art with me, thy rod and staff my comfort are. For me a table thou hast spread in presence of my foes. Thou dost anoint my head with oil, my cup it overflows. Goodness and mercy surely shall all my days follow me, and in the Lord's house I shall dwell so long as days shall be. Which I think the first time I saw it, I said, wow, what is this? But it is not really that bad a translation. It's made to be sung, but I think that the translators get the sense out of the Hebrew. And Hebrew was a very important language for the early divines. Both the Harvard and Yale, at Yale, the motto, light and truth, is translated lux et veritas, and also urim v'tumim, which are the two stones of discernment. But Hebrew was taught at you could not graduate from Yale or Harvard without knowing your Hebrew back in the 18th century. And on that, I will stop.
Beautiful. That's so wonderful. Harold, there are a bunch of questions in the chat. So why don't we
Okay, let me go back to,
questions?
okay, wow, I never knew about those notes. All right, so please repeat, or someone tell me the asterisk. The asterisk, I think, is there is a note on the side. There's a comparison to that text in another psalm or someplace else in the Bible. He shall feed me in green pastures, a pasture, Monica, I don't know exactly, it should be, oh, sorry, it should be pasture single. I think that this was my transposition of it. In the Old Anglican, yes, I made a mistake there. So Hazan Hirsch asked, okay, everyone thanks Sue, so interesting Yoda style. It would make a great kids book. Perhaps, yes. The verbs often at the end, Germanic influence, also made to be memorized. Lisa, I think you're probably right. For school children, thank you. Hebrew, so original manuscripts. The S is written as an F. Yes, the U and V and S and F, we could have a whole class just on that. And I see some hands up. I see Linda Solomon.
Yes, you do. Hi, Harold. What I found interesting was something you had skipped over in the Coverdale, is it?
Yes.
He uses the word convert instead of something else there.
Okay.
On the third verse, I think it was. It was very interesting that when I saw that.
You know what? I'm not going to take too much time to look through it, but I'm going to send it to everybody with that correction. And it's very interesting to read through them.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting that he used the word "you convert me."
Convert me, okay. And also, as the rabbi has taught us about modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew, that sometimes words that have a meaning in modern English have a different word in Shakespeare or in the King James Bible. And to think that they mean the same thing they mean now is to be misled. Hazan Hirsch.
Thanks for doing this, Harold. It's brilliant. Kol hakavod. I guess I just wanted to say that when I officiate at funerals, I tend to make an effort to refer to God without gender and to modernize texts. But this one, as you referred to, Harold, is really hard because I find that people over a certain age, even if I start reading a translation of Psalm 23, they'll start joining in and using, whether they're using King James or using the 1917 JPS, but they're doing maketh and guideth and all those things. And that is still what the funeral homes publish in their little pamphlets. And I don't know if and when that will ever change. So I just wanted to comment on that.
But I think that proves why the older version is in the Psalter and there were two versions in the Vulgate, because when it's something that's beloved that you memorize, you tend to push back against something that is more contemporary or perhaps more correct. And you can say, well, it's not actually the King James Version. You can say that they're quoting the 1917 JPS, the Jewish translation. Now, I have something else that the rabbi and I have been discussing. I've been in touch with David Kramer at the JTS library. JTS has the best rare book, has one of the world's leading collections of rare books. Lisa Brown is leaning in and she is nodding her head.
Jewish rare books. There are other
Right, of Jewish rare books. And I said to him, we have the Psalms class, and from time to time, we have shown things like the scan of the King James Bible or the Complutense, etc. Could we come up as a class for a tour of the rare book collection at JTS, and could someone pull out books that would be interested to a class studying Psalms? He said, absolutely, except that the books aren't back in the library yet, and they will not be back until later this year. So we are in contact with JTS, and we will be arranging a field trip to see all these magnificent things and more in the library when the books are there, and they are once again welcoming outsiders.
I want to add also that Harold referred to the Targum, the Aramaic Targum of the Bible, which was very common and obviously, as we've talked about, the Aramaic was the language that people spoke when Hebrew was not spoken, and around the time of Jesus, a couple hundred years before, a few hundred years afterwards. And the original text of the Targum in Aramaic exists in the Library of the Vatican. And that's the other place that there's which is not, by the way, cataloged. We don't know everything that the Vatican has in its Jewish rare book room, but it might be, just might be one of the best collections that we don't have a list of what's there. We know that Targum, it's called the Targum Neophiti, is the original Aramaic Targum. And the original is in the Vatican's basement somewhere. So Jewish scholars all over the world just drool at the idea of being able to get into the Vatican, which we can't. Oh wow, a virtual class with David Kramer on the Dead Sea Scrolls. That would be fantastic.
Yes, he's done.
Yes,
he's
there are
done.
lots of Targums, but Targum Neophiti is considered the the granddaddy of of Aramaic Targums. There are many that exist, but the Targum Neophiti and the original text of it's in the Vatican.
Joan Friedman had her hand up and then she put it down.
And Targum, of course, just means translation. So it's not only the Aramaic translations. It's typically used about Aramaic translations, but there's, yes.
So any other questions on the King James, the earlier translations, anything we discussed? So I'll turn it.
So I didn't get, where are the original King James copies? Where are they?
So it was printed. I don't know that they have the manuscript. They used to send the manuscripts to the printer, and the printer would mark them up and then sort of throw them out.
From the original printing, then.
I mean, it was widely printed. People made a live. There was an official printer. I don't know how many copies there were. It is a rare early book, but it's not like there are only a few copies around.
I think I saw it at the British Museum. Is that right?
Yeah, well, so since it was printed there, I can look it up. There are probably hundreds in circulation. I am sure that they have one at JTS.
Yeah.
Lisa Brown.
I was just wondering if the King James Version isn't considered to be actually a more literate translation of the Hebrew than the New Revised one. It's not archaic language notwithstanding.
What was the word you used? A more what translation?
If the King James Version was a closer translation to the Hebrew overall than the newer version, I'm forgetting, NRS.
So
Right.
I think that the relationship is like the new do you think that the new JPS is better or the old JPS? That well, Lisa, you now have studied Psalm 23 and see all of these translations. I guess I would throw it back to you and say, knowing the Hebrew and studying it, which one feels to you like it's the best it's the most
Well, I think none of the translations are actually literally what the Psalm says.
right.
But I was just wondering overall, just in terms of, the Torah, like all parts of the Tanakh. I was just wondering.
Well,
Right.
I will say that for Psalms, I turn to the King James Bible, and I find that the translation in the King James Bible, to me, has that mixture of correct translation and majesty of language. But then I'll also turn to Alter to say, okay, what does this say exactly? There are some errors in the King James Bible where we just understand more. Not a huge number of them, though. It's not as if, oh, well, now that we have more text and we understand more about the Hebrew, a lot of what's in the King James Bible is incorrect. Some of it has been updated. But I think I will leave it to you to decide which translation you feel. Now that I think in a class where we studied a dozen translations, is there one answer? Is there one answer for things? I don't know that I would turn to the King James Bible if I was reading, Chronicles, but certainly Isaiah, some of that language. Rabbi, what do you think? You're muted, or you're not turned on.
I stay away from that question. That's,
Okay.
I,
All right.
as I've tried to teach, I don't think that's answerable in a certain way. We all have our, I personally, I stay with the Hebrew, but if I'm studying something, I learn something from all the different translators and interpreters. And I think there is for me, and that's why we want to expose you to so many. So you develop your, and it might be one psalm, you really love what Fisher does with it, and it doesn't matter that it's not literal. And one psalm you might love what Alter does with it. So I don't see it as there's one answer fits all for me.
Sarah Siegel?
I learned from them all.
Harold, when you said I find the King James the most majestic, or however you put it, I thought it's a comments quasi question. Excuse me. You love classics, and so I'm just thinking. I don't know. It just makes me wonder. I've never talked to somebody who was a classics major. Like, what is that about the classic version of something that appeals to you versus?
Well, I will answer it in a different way. That Homer, for instance, has been translated for hundreds and hundreds of years. In looking into Chapman's Homer, it is generally translated retranslated every 20 years. And every translation that comes out, I look at it and I say, wow, this has some really great stuff in it. And then I go back to the Greek and say, just like with the Psalms, it is really an interpretation. There are great translations, but there's nothing like the experience of reading the Homer in the Greek or reading the Psalms in the Hebrew.
And every new translation will inform your Hebrew or your Greek, which is fun. So when I read a translation or a new interpretation, it helps me deepen my relationship to the Hebrew. I don't see it as a definitive answer, but it adds the textures. I want to say something about, I think, Sarah, your question is very deep because I want to also point out the issue about music, right? What you consider moving music has a lot to do with what is in your ear. So in 19th century Jewish life, classical music was what everybody's in the German synagogue tradition, people were listening to Beethoven and Mozart, et cetera, et cetera. So that makes sense that the majesty of Beethoven is going to make its way into the great synagogue music of the 19th century. But for people who have no exposure to classical music, it sounds off-putting and it sounds not moving. It sounds, pretentious. And people who grew up in the 50s and 60s and 70s of America respond to folk music as being the music of the soul, and therefore Jewish music that sounds like American folk music is much more accessible. But it doesn't mean that folk music is a deeper form of music than classical modes of music are. It means what you relate to says more about you than it does about the music, right? And that's always the case. But when we're fish swimming in the sea, we only see the water around us, and we can't imagine, wow, for somebody else, classical music, or the opposite, somebody for whom classical music, and they can't relate to folk music, classical music has that majesty and depth of emotion and complexity, and folk music sounds, simple and superficial. So, but it all matters what your context is, and that's what's really profound about translations. Also, if you have that, and it really reflects. So, for people who read very, that's why one of the goals of the class is to expose people to all the different kind of interpretations there are. Some which maintain a kind of level of majesty and transcendence. That's legitimate, and others which go deeply, deeply intimate and remove any sense of majesty because it is experienced as an off-putting thing. So there isn't a right or a wrong or a value judgment. It's a matter of who we are and what we bring to prayer, what we bring to what speaks to us as being profound. And you can develop different appetites, right? You can develop it. I certainly have in my life. I've changed a lot in what I respond to. Catherine.
You know, I've been following along with the King James Version, and I've really been surprised how close it is. I expected to find big discrepancies, and it's so close. And the only place I found a problem was Psalm 22. But the other Psalms and Psalm 23, they're so close to the Sepharia. I've just been so impressed. I expected to find big, big differences. And I so appreciate what we've done in this class, and I'm so grateful to everything that I'm learning. But I just wanted to say that, you know, I love the King James Version, and I'm following along, and I expect, oh boy, this is where I'm really going to find.
Right.
Not
Catherine, I had exactly the same experience. I thought, wow, now that I'm really studying them in Hebrew, I'm going to go back and mark up and say, oh, they misunderstood, they mistranslated, they're reinterpreting. But I did not personally didn't find that. And I will just say that the same question of translation holds for the Quran, that in traditional Islam, there is no such thing as a translation of the Quran. The Quran is chanted and studied in Arabic because it is understood to be exactly the word of God through the Prophet Muhammad. And traditionally, what we consider translation is called an interpretation or notes on the Quran. And there was not a published translation of the Quran until modern times because it was forbidden, just as it seems like it was forbidden to publish or not publish to formalize the Targum because it was, because if you then write it down and publish it, it tends to become official. That you will go, there isn't an official one that is used in any mosque. They say, well, here's one, here's one, here's one. But if you want to understand what God said to Muhammad, you have to understand the Arabic. So that is our time. I hope this was interesting. I will send all of these handouts around. I look forward to seeing these things. And Rabbi, thank you so much for giving me the time for this little personal disquisition.
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you, Harold. It's such an honor for us to learn from you. And the Dead Sea Scrolls did include Psalms, but we won't talk about that today because we're at the end of time.
Right.
And maybe another point I'll talk about that. And the room will stay open for about 10 minutes.
And then tomorrow we will start with offerings, right?
Yes,
we have
offerings.
beautiful offerings for Psalm 23, including a number from people who either have never participated before or haven't participated recently. All right, everybody?
June 23rd, which I think is that a week from tomorrow? I'm just very confused about dates.
Yeah.
Joyce and Sam are going to come to do some music, and that'll be an hour class on June 23rd.